My name is Aisha, and my family lives in a world of polished glass and handshakes. They trade in high-end real estate closing deals with a whisper and a smile. Me, my world smells of oil and honest sweat. I spend my days bringing old cars back to life, finding the beauty in what others see as broken and forgotten. We've always had a quiet agreement to stay in our own lanes. But last Christmas at the family dinner, my father decided to tear up the rulebook. He looked me dead in the eye and in front of a room full of people, called me too stupid to live in the kind of place he inhabits. And my sister, Tiana, rolled her eyes and muttered that I'd never afford a place like this. He also said my life was meaningless, a hobby for people who couldn't handle the real world. But what he didn't know was that while he was busy building a house of cards, I was quietly rebuilding something else entirely. Something with wheels. Something with power. And that night, I was about to show him that my little hobby was the only thing standing between his fragile empire and a very sudden collapse. This is the story of how a girl with dirty hands took back her worth, one bolt at a time. They say the holidays are about family, about being home. But for me, home hasn't been a place since I was a teenager. It's just a reminder of everything I'm not, everything I'll never be in their eyes. The Christmas dinner was held at the Sterling Rose, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood. The kind of place with white tablecloths so pristine they look like fresh snow, and waiters who move like silent ghosts. My family, the Brooks family, always chose these places. It was a performance, a way to show the world how successful and united they were. But for me, it was always the most excruciating 3 hours of the year. My father, Marcus Brooks, was the star of the show, a titan in commercial real estate. He had a smile for everyone, as long as they were of a certain class. He was 58 years old, with a deep laugh that could fill a room, but a stare that could make you feel invisible. My mother, Denise, 56, sat beside him, her face a mask of polite perfection. Then there was my older sister, Tiana, 32, a corporate marketing hotshot who radiated an energy of effortless success. And finally, my younger brother, Jamel, 27, a law student who always seemed to be looking anywhere but at me, as if he knew what was coming. I was the black sheep, the one who didn't fit in. While they talked about their latest ventures and luxury vacations, I sat there quiet, listening to the clinking of silver and the murmur of polite conversation. They made a point of not asking me about my life, a silent agreement to pretend my world didn't exist. My world was grease and metal and the honest scent of motor oil. I own and run a garage specializing in vintage car restoration, a detail they conveniently ignored. The tension started to build when Tiana, with a practiced grace, began talking about her recent promotion. She described her sleek new office downtown and how she was now managing a team of 20 people. My father beamed with pride, his eyes shining as he listened to her. When she finished, he raised his glass and gave a toast. But it wasn't a general one. It was a deliberate, pointed toast to Tiana and Jamel, to the future of our family. He looked right at me as he said it, his gaze holding a subtle disdain that I had learned to recognize over the years. Aisha, he said, and the way he said my name, it sounded like a title for something lowly, something dirty. Tell us, how is that little hobby of yours going? I didn't answer right away. I just took a slow sip of water. I could feel Jamel shift uncomfortably in his seat. It's not a hobby, Dad, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It's my career. It's going well. My father let out a short, hollow laugh. Going well, Aisha, you're 29 years old. You should have a corner office and a 6-figure salary, not grease under your fingernails. Honestly, you're too stupid to live here to even fit into this family. You should just get out. The words hit me like a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to go thin. My mother, Denise, gave a quick, sharp shake of her head, a silent warning to my father to be more discreet. But she didn't say a word to defend me. Tiana, sensing her moment to land a final punch, rolled her eyes and muttered to Jamel just loud enough for me to hear, "She'll never afford a place like this." I felt something inside me finally break. The anger, the shame, the years of quiet resentment all boiled to the surface. I looked from my father's smug face to Tiana's condescending sneer. I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest. It was a cold laugh, one with no joy in it. It was the sound of a woman who had finally had enough. I stood up slowly, making sure every eye was on me. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I took a deep breath and I said the words I had been rehearsing for months. The one line that was going to change everything. Then let this stupid person take back her $1.2 million. The whole table froze. My father's jaw dropped. The clinking of silverware stopped. For the first time in my life, I had their full, undivided attention. 200 pounds of pressure per square inch. That's the force needed to fully restore a vintage tire. It's a precise number, a tangible goal. It's the opposite of everything my family stands for. Their world is all about appearances, about presenting a perfect picture. There's no precision in that, just a vague, shifting standard of what's good enough. It made me feel like I was in a completely different world from them, and the truth is, I was. It was 3 hours before the dinner. My hands, stained with a mix of grease and rust, were carefully cleaning the engine of a 1973 Lincoln Continental. I was in my element. The smell of oil, the quiet hum of the workshop, the feel of the wrench in my hand. This was my space. My garage, Brooks Classic Restorations, wasn't just a business. It was my refuge. I had started it 8 years ago with a small loan from a local bank, something my father had scoffed at. He had wanted me to go into real estate to work for his company, but I couldn't stand the thought of it. All that talk about closing deals and client management felt so empty to me. I'd rather spend all day with a 40-year-old car than a 40-year-old man in a suit. My parents always saw my passion as a phase of childish rebellion. I remember my father's sneer when I showed him my first restored car. "You're going to get your hands dirty for the rest of your life, Aisha. That's not a legacy." He always talked about legacy. My legacy was right here, in the sweat and the metal and the roar of a perfectly tuned engine. It was real. It wasn't built on flimsy contracts and empty promises. The phone buzzed on my workbench, a sudden jolt that broke my concentration. It was Jamel, my younger brother, the law student, the golden boy. He wasn't like Tiana, who always treated me with condescension, or my father, who was openly dismissive. Jamel was just quiet. He would call sometimes asking how I was, but our conversations were always short, as if he was afraid of being caught. "Hey, Aisha," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Are you going to Christmas dinner?" "I guess so. Mom sent me a text, said not to be late." There was a long pause, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Look," he finally said, "I shouldn't be telling you this, but something's not right. The real estate market's been tough, and Dad's been having some cash flow problems." I heard him on the phone with his partner, and he sounded desperate. He kept talking about a big deal he needed to close to bail himself out, a big loan from some new investor. My heart started to pound. I had been hearing whispers about my father's company, Golden Legacy Properties, for a while now. He had been overly quiet about his work, and the last time I saw him, he had been short-tempered and stressed, which was highly unusual for him. He always prided himself on being unflappable. "What kind of deal?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know the details, just that it was a big one. He kept saying it was the last chance. Look, I gotta go. Just be careful tonight, Aisha." He hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stood there for a long time, the smell of gasoline and oil filling my lungs. I hadn't been to my parents' house in 2 years, not since a massive argument about my business. He had told me I was a disappointment and a failure. I had left without a word and hadn't looked back. But now, with Jamel's warning, the past and present collided. I knew what I had to do. I walked to the back of the garage, to a filing cabinet that held the real secret to my business. I didn't just restore cars for people. I had been building a quiet, powerful empire. My clients were wealthy car collectors and high-profile individuals, and their money had allowed me to create a separate investment fund. I was the silent partner in several small ventures, and I had been buying up the debt of failing companies in Atlanta's volatile real estate market. I had always known this day might come, the day I would be in a position of power. I had a file with my father's company name on it. I had been keeping tabs on him for a year since I had a bad feeling in my gut. As I looked at the file, I saw my own life reflected back at me. A life of being overlooked and underestimated. But I had used their disdain as my fuel. I had built an empire in the shadows, and now it was time for the world to see what that stupid person could do. I grabbed my keys, a crisp white envelope with my name on it, and drove away in my Honda Civic. It wasn't as sleek as the restored cars in my garage, but it was mine. It was a symbol of my independence, of the fact that I didn't need anything from them. As I drove through the Atlanta streets, a calm settled over me. I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready. I was going to that dinner not as a guest, but as a silent investor, a collector of debt, a harbinger of karma. My family wanted to play a game. Fine, I'd play too. And I was going to win. Sometimes a moment in time can just freeze you. You're living your life, moving along, and then all of a sudden, one little conversation, one passing comment, becomes the cornerstone of your entire existence. For me, that moment happened 10 years ago. I was 19 years old, and my father was hosting a barbecue for his business partners at our house in North Buckhead. It was one of those big, show-off parties with manicured lawns and perfectly placed patio furniture, the kind with a caterer serving pulled pork from a silver tray. The guests were all a reflection of my father's world: men in crisp linen, shirts with expensive watches, women in designer sundresses with perfectly coiffed hair, their laughter echoing a little too loudly across the property. I was in my own world, of course. I'd spent the entire morning in the garage behind the house, my own private sanctuary. The air in there smelled of old rubber and gasoline, the scent of honest work. I was deep in the bowels of a 1973 Ford pickup truck that a neighbor had given me. It was rusted out and dented, a relic of a different time. But I saw something in it. I saw potential. I saw the ghost of this powerful machine it once was, and I felt a call to bring it back to life. When my mother's assistant came to call me for lunch, my hands were stained with a mix of grease and rust, with dirt under my fingernails and a streak of oil on my cheek. I hadn't even thought to clean up. I was just proud of the progress I had made. The engine, after 3 days of tinkering, had finally turned over. My father saw me walking across the perfectly manicured lawn, and his face immediately hardened. The pride he wore so easily for his colleagues evaporated, replaced by a deep, weary disapproval. He stopped in the middle of a conversation with a tall man in a navy blue blazer and a woman with an impossibly perfect hairstyle. He gestured for me to come closer, and I remember a tiny prickle of fear. But mostly, I just wanted to show him how the truck's engine was finally starting to run. I felt like I had a piece of magic in my hands, a real accomplishment I could share. "This is my daughter Aisha," he said to his guests, his voice a little too loud, a little too strained. "She spends all her time out in the garage playing with old cars." The word "playing" felt like a slap. I could hear the condescension in his tone, a subtle way of telling them I was a child. The man in the blazer offered a polite, distant smile. The woman just looked me up and down, a look of thinly veiled disgust in her eyes. It was a look I would come to know well. "Playing," I said, trying to stand a little taller, to put a little bit of pride in my voice. "It's not playing, Dad. I'm learning how to restore them. I want to open my own garage someday." My father's laugh was sharp and humorless. It cut through the gentle hum of the party, and for a moment, everyone seemed to turn their heads to look. "A garage, Aisha, don't be ridiculous. That's a hobby. A project for a Saturday afternoon, not a future. You're almost 20. What are you going to do with your life? What kind of legacy will you build, with oil and rust?" "It's an honest living," I said, my voice shaking a little now, but I held my ground. "I'm good at it. It's real. I can make things work." He took a step closer to me, his voice lowering but filled with a quiet intensity that was more frightening than his public disapproval. "It's a dirty, stupid job for men who couldn't cut it in the real world," he said, and his words were a final, devastating blow. He wasn't even looking at me anymore. He was looking at his business partners, his face a mask of disappointment. "Frankly," he said, "I think you're too stupid to understand what a real future looks like. It's not out in a garage. It's in an office in a boardroom closing deals." I stood there for what felt like an eternity. The sun was hot on my skin, but I felt so cold. I wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the ground. The worst part was not his words, but the fact that he said them in front of everyone. He didn't just hurt me, he shamed me. He made me feel like an embarrassing secret, a failure he had to apologize for. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The tears that had been stinging my eyes dried up. The shame gave way to a cold, hard resolve. I walked away from the party, back to the garage, and I didn't stop to look back. I spent the rest of the day and night working on that old truck. I didn't eat, I didn't rest. The ache in my heart found its way into my hands, and I turned it into fuel. Every rusty bolt I cleaned, every squeaky hinge I fixed, was an act of defiance. My work wasn't just about restoring cars anymore. It was about restoring myself. It was about proving him wrong, not just with my words, but with my actions. I knew that day I would never be able to live up to his expectations, so I stopped trying. I decided to forge my own path, to build my own legacy. One bolt at a time, one engine at a time, I built my life from the ground up. I didn't need their approval. I had my hands, my knowledge, and a quiet fire inside me. It was a fire that had been smoldering for 10 years, and tonight, at that fancy Christmas dinner, it was finally time to watch it burn. The silence was so absolute you could hear the whispers of the other diners, at tables far away. My father's face, which just moments ago had been a mask of smug satisfaction, was now completely blank. He looked at me as if I had spoken in some ancient, forgotten language. It wasn't a look of anger yet, just pure, unadulterated confusion. My sister Tiana let out a little puff of air, a short, disbelieving laugh. My mother's hand, which had been resting on the tablecloth, slowly curled into a fist. They were all waiting for me to clarify, to explain, to tell them I was making a joke, but I wasn't. I watched as my father's expression finally shifted. The confusion morphed into a patronizing smirk, a look he had perfected over the years. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. "Aisha," he said, and this time his voice was soft, laced with a pity so false it made my skin crawl. "What on earth are you talking about? $1.2 million, is this? One of your little jokes I'm afraid I don't follow." "You don't follow, Dad?" I said, a smile playing on my lips. "I think you follow perfectly. The Golden Legacy Properties Real Estate Fund, the one you're so proud of, the one that's supposed to be your biggest accomplishment. You've told every single person in this restaurant about it tonight, haven't you?" The smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed slightly and he glanced at my mother. I could see the silent conversation passing between them. A fleeting moment of shared concern. It was the first sign of weakness I had ever seen from him. "That fund is a testament to my hard work and vision," he said, his voice now a low growl. "It's a multi-million-dollar venture. What would you know about it? You spend your days with grease under your fingernails playing with rusted cars." "You're right," I said, my voice still calm, still steady. "I do spend my days with grease under my fingernails. But you know what else I spend my days doing? Dad, I spend my days managing a high-end vintage car restoration business. My clients aren't your typical Sunday car show hobbyists. They're CEOs, venture capitalists, people who understand the value of a solid investment and a real legacy. They're people who have given me the capital to start my own investment fund. A small one, of course, for my little hobby." His face paled, but he held on to a shred of defiance. "And what does any of this have to do with me?" "Everything," I said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. "It has everything to do with you. I've been keeping tabs on you, Dad. I've been watching your Golden Legacy Properties for the last 6 months. It's been a fascinating case study. You're losing money hand over fist. Your last 2 projects were a bust, and your loan from Wells Fargo came with a high-interest rider. You were a month late on the last payment, weren't you?" A choked sound came from my mother. Her face was ashen. My father's expression was no longer one of annoyance or condescension. It was pure, unfiltered fear. How could I possibly know these things? They were secrets, the kind of things he would never talk about outside his closed-door meetings. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me tell you something, Dad. The real estate market in Atlanta has been brutal. Your vision was a little short-sighted. You were drowning in debt and no bank was willing to give you a lifeline. You went to your partners, but they all turned you down. You even considered selling this house, didn't you? Just to pay off the bank before they foreclosed." Tiana gasped. Jamel was staring at me with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. He had given me a piece of the puzzle, but he couldn't have known I had already solved the entire thing. "You're making this up." My father spat out, his voice a desperate hiss. "You don't know anything. I'm a successful man. You're a child playing with toys." "Am I?" I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Your entire company was set to default. You needed a miracle. And you got one, didn't you? A mysterious investor came out of nowhere and bought up all your high-interest debt, saving your project from certain ruin. They even signed a non-disclosure agreement to keep your reputation intact. It was the biggest stroke of luck you've had in years." He was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling. He knew. He didn't have to say a word. He knew what I was about to say. My mother's hand found his and she squeezed it, a silent plea for him to stay calm. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I saw a reflection of my own power in his gaze. I felt a sense of calm, of vindication. It wasn't about hurting him anymore. It was about showing him. "You were right about one thing, Dad. I was stupid. Stupid to think you would ever see me for who I am. Stupid to think you would ever believe in me. But tell me this," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for every single person at that table to hear. "Do you know who that mysterious investor was, Dad? Do you know who secretly bailed out your project?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and full of unreleased tension. My father's face was frozen in a mask of disbelief, his jaw slack. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He looked at my mother, then at my sister, a desperate search for an answer they couldn't possibly have. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He was exposed, and the silence was deafening. Just then, as if on cue, a man in a crisp suit approached our table. He was the manager of the Sterling Rose, a man named Ronnie. He had a kind face, with lines around his eyes that showed he was used to smiling. He approached me directly, bypassing my family, as if they weren't even there. "Aisha, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, a genuine warmth in his voice that was so jarring in this cold, sterile environment. "I saw you from across the room and just had to come over and thank you again. The Gilded Spoon wouldn't be open for Christmas dinner if it weren't for you." My family's heads swiveled from me to him. Their polite smiles were gone, replaced by looks of pure, unadulterated confusion. My father's hand, which had been grasping the table's edge, went limp. He didn't know this man. He certainly didn't know what he was talking about. "Ronnie, it's really no problem," I said, a little smile on my face. "Just glad I could help." "Help? Help what?" my mother Denise finally said, her voice sharp and strained. "Ronnie, do we know you?" "Denise," Ronnie said politely. "I'm the manager here, but Aisha and I have a shared history. She's the reason my restaurant, The Gilded Spoon, is still operating. We were on the brink of foreclosure a year and a half ago, about to lose everything. A silent investor came in and bought our debt, giving us a second chance." He looked at me with deep gratitude. The investor was Aisha. She saw our potential when no one else would. She saved 100 jobs and a legacy my family had worked for generations to build. He gave me a final thankful nod and walked away, leaving a silence even heavier than the one before. My father's jaw was clenched now, his eyes darting around the table as if looking for an explanation. My sister Tiana let out a nervous laugh. "Aisha, you invested in a restaurant, you?" "You sound surprised, Tiana," I said calmly. "You're not the only one with an eye for business." Just as I finished my sentence, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile walked past our table. It was Ms. Shirley, an old neighbor from our childhood street in West End. She had always been kind to me, unlike my family. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Aisha, honey, I just saw you," she said, her voice full of genuine affection. "My grandson Jeremiah just got his acceptance letter to Morehouse College. He got a full-ride scholarship just like you told me he would. That little education fund you started for him when he was just a boy? It made all the difference. God bless you." She gave me a gentle pat on the arm and continued on her way. My family looked at each other stunned. A full-ride scholarship to Morehouse. A little education fund. These were things they would have known about if they had ever bothered to talk to me. But they hadn't. They had been too busy with their own lives, their own image. My father's face was a mixture of outrage and confusion. "Aisha, what is this, an act? A show?" "A show?" I said, a cold laugh escaping my lips. "No, Dad, this is real life. This is what I do. While you and Mom were building your legacy on flimsy contracts and empty promises, I was building mine. One honest transaction at a time." My mother Denise, who had been silent up to this point, spoke up, her voice hushed and full of suppressed anger. "Aisha, stop this! Whatever game you're playing, it's time to end it. We are not discussing family finances in public." "Oh, but we are, Mom," I said, leaning forward. "You've been discussing my life and my career in public for years. You've been calling me a failure in front of every friend and colleague you have. Now it's my turn." My father put a hand to his head, his usual confident demeanor completely gone. He looked at me with a new expression, not one of condescension, but of fear. He no longer saw me as his stupid daughter. He saw me as a stranger, a powerful, quiet force he had never understood. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was winning. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and full of unreleased tension. My father's face was frozen in a mask of disbelief, his jaw slack. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He looked at my mother, then at my sister, a desperate search for an answer they couldn't possibly have. It was the first time in my life that he was at a complete loss for words, a man who had built his entire identity on having all the answers. The silence was so absolute you could hear the distant, polite chatter from other tables, the gentle clinking of silverware, the soft music playing over the speakers. Everything else in the room seemed to be moving in a different dimension, a different reality than the one unfolding at our table. Just as the silence was becoming unbearable, a man in a crisp suit approached our table. He was the manager of the Sterling Rose, a man named Ronnie. He had a kind face, with deep lines around his eyes that showed he was used to smiling and had seen a thing or two. He approached me directly, bypassing my family as if they weren't even there. "Aisha, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, a genuine warmth in his voice that was so jarring in this cold, sterile environment. "I saw you from across the room and just had to come over and thank you again." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at me. "The Gilded Spoon wouldn't be open for Christmas dinner if it weren't for you. You really were an angel sent to us in our darkest hour." My family's heads swiveled from me to him. Their polite smiles were gone, replaced by looks of pure, unadulterated confusion. My father's hand, which had been grasping the table's edge, went limp. He didn't know this man. He certainly didn't know what he was talking about. "Ronnie, it's really no problem," I said, a small smile on my face. "Just glad I could help." Help with what?" my mother Denise finally said, her voice sharp and strained. "Ronnie, do we know you?" "Denise," Ronnie said politely, a subtle hint of disapproval in his tone. I'm the manager here, but Aisha and I have a shared history. A year and a half ago, my family's restaurant, the Gilded Spoon, was on the brink of foreclosure. We were about to lose everything, a legacy my parents had spent 40 years building in West End. We went to every bank, every investor, and they all saw us as a lost cause. But then a silent investor came in and bought our debt, giving us a second chance. He looked at me with deep gratitude. The investor was Aisha. She saw our potential when no one else would. She saved 100 jobs and a legacy we had worked for generations to build. She didn't ask for a single thing in return. She just said she believed in us. He gave me a final, thankful nod and walked away, leaving a silence even heavier than the one before. My father's jaw was clenched now, his eyes darting around the table as if looking for an explanation. My sister Tiana let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. Aisha, you invested in a restaurant. You what on earth for? You sound surprised. Tiana, I said calmly. You're not the only one with an eye for business. Some of us just choose to invest in things with a little more soul. Just as I finished my sentence, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile walked past our table. It was Ms. Shirley, an old neighbor from our childhood street in West End. She had always been a kind and gentle presence in my life, unlike my family. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. Aisha, honey, I just saw you, she said, her voice full of genuine affection. My grandson Jeremiah just got his acceptance letter to Morehouse College. He got a full-ride scholarship just like you told me he would. That little education fund you started for him when he was just a boy, it made all the difference, God bless you. She gave me a gentle pat on the arm and continued on her way. My family looked at each other stunned. A full-ride scholarship to Morehouse. A little education fund. These were things they would have known about if they had ever bothered to talk to me. But they hadn't. They had been too busy with their own lives, their own image. The charity they participated in was always public, always for a reason. For me, it was always quiet and always for a person. My father's face was a mixture of outrage and confusion, and his voice was strained. Aisha, what is this, a staged act, a show? A show, I said, a cold laugh escaping my lips. No, Dad, this is real life. This is what I do. While you and Mom were building your legacy on flimsy contracts and empty promises, I was building mine, one honest transaction at a time, one person at a time. My mother, Denise, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up, her voice hushed and full of suppressed anger. Aisha, stop this. Whatever game you're playing, it's time to end it. We are not discussing family finances in public. Oh, but we are, Mom, I said, leaning forward. You've been discussing my life and my career in public for years. You've been calling me a failure in front of every friend and colleague you have. Now it's my turn. My father put a hand to his head, his usual confident demeanor completely gone. He looked at me with a new expression, not one of condescension, but of fear. He no longer saw me as his stupid daughter. He saw me as a stranger, a powerful, quiet force he had never understood, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was winning. I could see the panic in his eyes, the realization that the man who had the power to save him was, in fact, the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to tear down. He had been so focused on his own world, his own grand plans, that he had never once looked at me and seen a human being with thoughts, feelings, and ambitions. He had only ever seen disappointment. Now he was seeing a reckoning, and I was just getting started. I had more to say, more to reveal. And for the first time, they were all ready to listen. The polite smiles were gone for good now. My family sat in a stunned silence that felt more dangerous than any screaming match. My father was no longer just confused. He was enraged, but it was a quiet, cold fury born of powerlessness. He looked at me, then at the empty spaces where Ronnie and Miss Shirley had stood as if trying to find the wires, the hidden cameras, anything to explain what had just happened. For a man who built his life on control, this was his worst nightmare, a public theatrical loss of it. This is ridiculous, Aisha, he said, his voice a low, threatening hiss. He looked around the room with a practiced air of a man trying to maintain composure. This is some kind of performance. You've hired these people. They're just actors. You're trying to humiliate me. Why would I need to hire actors, Dad? I said, my voice still as calm as a summer lake. You've been humiliating me for 20 years for free. This is just an overdue conversation. My mother, Denise, leaned in, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and rage. She gripped my father's arm with a strength I hadn't seen from her before. Aisha, you need to stop this immediately. What is wrong with you? This is your family. This is Christmas dinner. No, Mom, I said, looking her directly in the eye. This is a reckoning, and it's not over yet. You and Dad wanted to talk about my future, about my intelligence, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the future of Golden Legacy Properties. My father visibly recoiled. He looked around the room as if worried someone else might hear. He straightened his tie with a shaky hand, an attempt to reassert his authority. Aisha, I'm warning you. This has gone far enough. What would you, a common mechanic, know about my business? You don't have the education. You don't have the experience. He paused, his gaze filled with a condescension that was a decade in the making. You've never taken a single business class. You've never spent a single day in a real boardroom. All you know is the smell of oil and the feel of a wrench. That's the funny part, Dad. I do, I said, and a cold smile touched my lips. I know that Golden Legacy Properties had an impressive portfolio 3 years ago with a valuation of around $68 million. I know you secured a 3-year bridge loan from the First Piedmont Bank at an 8% interest rate, a rate you considered a steal at the time. A solid start, a real legacy. But then the market shifted. I paused, letting the silence build, letting the full weight of my words sink in. My father's face was now ashen. He was watching me with a look of pure terror. These were not public facts. These were details from his private quarterly reports. My mother's perfectly manicured hand reached out and gripped his arm even tighter, her eyes pleading with me to stop. The 2 mixed-use condo projects you had near the Beltline fell through. I continued, my voice gaining a confident momentum. The high-end retail space in West End lost its anchor tenant. It's hard to build a legacy on empty storefronts, isn't it? I know that your development was facing a major liquidity crisis, and your partners were getting cold feet. You were a single late payment away from default. The last 30 days were a nightmare for you. I know because I was watching. His face was a mask of disbelief. How do you know that? My father rasped, his voice barely a whisper. That's confidential information. Oh, it was, I said, a sense of deep satisfaction spreading through me. But you know, a lot of information gets out when you're desperate. I found out that your project was facing a major liquidity crisis. You were on the verge of defaulting on your loan. You had nowhere to turn. You even tried to secure a second mortgage on this house, didn't you? Just to cover the interest payments. Tiana gasped. Jamel was staring at me with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. He had given me a piece of the puzzle, but he couldn't have known I had already solved the entire thing. You're making this up. My father spat out his voice, a desperate hiss. You don't know anything. You're a child playing with toys. Am I? I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Your entire company was set to default. You were one step away from losing it all. And then a miracle happened, didn't it? A mysterious investor came out of nowhere and bought up all your high-interest debt, saving your project from certain ruin. They even signed a non-disclosure agreement to keep your reputation intact. It was the biggest stroke of luck you've had in years. He was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling. He knew. He didn't have to say a word. He knew what I was about to say. My mother's hand found his and she squeezed it, a silent plea for him to stay calm. He looked at me with a new expression, not one of condescension, but of fear. He no longer saw me as his stupid daughter. He saw me as a stranger, a powerful, quiet force he had never understood. And I was just getting started. I had more to say, more to reveal. I can tell you exactly why that investor decided to step in, Dad. I can tell you the exact moment they made the decision to save you. And I can tell you exactly what they are going to do next. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I saw a reflection of my own power in his gaze. I felt a sense of calm, of vindication. It wasn't about hurting him anymore. It was about showing him. You were right about one thing, Dad. I was stupid. Stupid to think you would ever see me for who I am. Stupid to think you would ever believe in me. But tell me this, I said, my voice clear and loud enough for every single person at that table to hear. Do you know who that mysterious investor was, Dad? Do you know who secretly bailed out your project? The silence that followed my last words was heavier than any conversation could have been. My father was staring at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was completely, utterly speechless. His perfect, polished life, the one he had built on the assumption that he was smarter and more successful than everyone else, was beginning to crumble right in front of him. My mother was still gripping his arm, her knuckles white. Even Tiana was quiet. The condescension wiped clean from her face, replaced by a stunned, fearful fascination. It was in this moment of perfect stillness that a new voice broke the silence. Apologies for the interruption. The voice was calm, professional, and familiar. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I believe this table has some urgent business to attend to. Darius, my lawyer, appeared beside our table. He was a man in his mid-50s, with a quiet confidence that radiated from him like heat. He had a briefcase in his hand, and he set it on the table with a soft click. My father's eyes darted from me to him, a new wave of panic washing over his face. He knew who Darius was. He had seen him at charity galas and corporate events, always a formidable presence, always a man of immense respect and power. "Darius, what is this?" my father finally managed to stammer out. I don't understand." "Mr. Brooks," Darius said, his voice even and measured, "I am here on behalf of my client. My client recently completed a transaction that I believe you are well aware of." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly organized documents. "On November 10th of this year, a holding company called Legacy Restorations LLC purchased the outstanding bridge loan debt of your company, Golden Legacy Properties, from First Piedmont Bank. The full purchase amount was $1.2 million at a significant discount to the original value." The words hit my father like a series of body blows. He was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was staring at the documents, his eyes trying to comprehend the words on the page. His mind, the same mind that had dismissed my entire life's work as stupid, was now trying to make sense of a reality he had never once considered. "Legacy Restorations," my father whispered, the name sounding foreign and alien on his lips. That's a shell corporation. I did a lot of research on it. The board of directors is anonymous. The ownership is anonymous. I had no idea who was behind it. I was just so grateful to have the debt off my hands. It saved me. It saved all of this." He gestured around the restaurant, a desperate plea for me to see his side of things. "That's correct," Darius said, his voice still calm. "But it's no longer anonymous. As of this morning, all records have been updated to reflect the true owner. My client, Aisha Brooks." The words spoken so simply were a final devastating blow. My father sank back in his chair, his face completely devoid of color. The perfect, polished facade he had worn for 58 years, finally, completely shattered. My mother let out a small, strangled cry, and Tiana, my fierce, successful sister, just stared at me, her mouth hanging open. "Aisha," my father said, his voice a broken plea. You bought my debt. You used your little business to save me." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt no anger, no hatred, just a deep, profound sense of justice. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about showing him that the very thing he had ridiculed, the very thing he had called stupid, was the only thing with the power to save him. The legacy he had built on vanity and empty promises was on the verge of ruin, and the only person who had the means to stop it was his daughter, the one he had tried to bury. I looked at him and said, "I told you, Dad, my legacy is real. It's built on honest work. It's built on helping people. You may not have been able to see that, but a lot of people did. And now you're the one who owes me. Not just for the $1.2 million, but for the respect you never gave me." He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. He looked at me, then at Darius, then at the documents on the table. It was all real. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a show. It was a cold, hard legal fact. The man who had dismissed me as too stupid to understand a real future was now completely, utterly in my power. He couldn't believe it. He wouldn't. And I knew in that moment that this was the most powerful thing I could have ever done. This was the moment his legacy finally died. My father's face was a study in absolute unfiltered horror. He was staring at the documents, then at Darius, then at me, as if his brain was unable to process the simple, devastating truth. He had been so blind, so caught up in his own world of success and power, that he had never once looked at me as an equal, much less a threat. The man who had built an empire on making sure every detail was in place was now completely undone by the one person he had never bothered to look at. My mother, Denise, was the first to regain some composure. She leaned over, her voice a low hiss of desperation. "Marcus, stop this. Get a hold of yourself. This is a misunderstanding. Aisha, honey, you need to tell us what this is all about. You're scaring your father." "I'm not scaring him, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "I'm just telling the truth." "The truth?" My father said, his voice now a broken, terrified whisper. "What other truth is there? You have all the power. You own me. What else could you possibly want?" "Oh, it's not about power, Dad," I said, leaning in. "It's about justice. It's about karma. You see, I spent a lot of time and a lot of money learning about your business. And the more I learned about your business, the more I learned about your legacy." I looked at my mother, who flinched. She knew what I was about to say. She had always been a silent partner in his schemes, the one who looked the other way while he cut corners and broke the law. She was the one who had told me, "Your father knows what's best." She had convinced me to trust him, to believe in his grand plans, even as they fell apart. "Let's talk about the company you started 20 years ago, before you made it big. Brooks and Associates. The one you never talk about anymore." I said, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. "That little development firm that built a dozen properties in the West End. You know, the same neighborhood where Ms. Shirley, our old neighbor, lives. The same neighborhood where you and Mom built your first home." My mother's face went completely white. She looked at my father with a panicked expression. He was staring at me, his eyes now filled with a desperate rage. "You're out of line, Aisha," he said, his voice regaining some of its old authority, a final, desperate attempt to take back control. "You don't know anything about that. That was a different time, a different company." "Oh, I know plenty," I said, my voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "I know about the land you bought for a pittance from a poor farmer, a man who didn't know the land was set to be rezoned for commercial use. You and Mom, you convinced him that his land was worthless. You promised him you would build a beautiful community for his family. And then, you turned around and sold it to a developer for a $20 million profit. That was your first real big win, wasn't it?" My father's knuckles were white as he gripped the table. "You have no proof. That was a long time ago. No one remembers that." "I remember," I said, my voice full of a quiet, burning intensity. "I found the lawsuit. The man who owned the land, he sued you. He lost everything and you won. You built your legacy on his tears. You built your fortune on a lie. You built a life for our family on the broken dreams of a poor farmer. That's your legacy, Dad. That's who you are." He was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling. His eyes were no longer focused on me, but on some distant memory, a past he thought he had buried forever. Tiana was watching me with a look of pure horror. Her whole life she had believed in her father's perfect image, in his flawless reputation. Now it was all being dismantled in front of her eyes. "And that wasn't the only one, was it, Mom?" I said, turning my gaze to her. "What about the small business owners you and Dad promised to help, the ones who trusted you to manage their investments? You told them you would help them save for retirement. You promised them a legacy, and then you used their money to fund your real estate ventures. You took their dreams, their hard work, and you turned it into your own. That's who you are." My mother's hand went to her mouth, a silent gasp of shame. She had never been a public figure like my father, but she had always been his partner in crime. She had looked the other way, and she had benefited from his schemes. "What is this, a speech?" My father said, his voice weak and defeated. "What are you going to do? Tell everyone ruin us?" I looked at him, and I felt a sense of finality. He had no power left. His reputation, his legacy, his life, it was all a lie. He had nothing left to lose, and I had everything to gain. The only thing left to do was to tell him what I was going to do next, and that was the most satisfying part of all. My father's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had always stood so tall, so full of pride, was now a small, broken figure. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps, his entire body seeming to shrink under the weight of my words. My mother Denise sat next to him, her perfect facade completely gone. The polished mask of polite society had shattered, revealing a face etched with raw, panicked desperation. She was staring at me, her eyes filled with a helpless fury, as if she wanted to lash out but had no idea where to even begin. Tiana was just quiet. She didn't have a comeback. She didn't have a clever remark. She just sat there, her own carefully constructed world of corporate success and family reputation crumbling in a single silent moment. The full weight of the truth was settling in on her, and it was a horrifying weight. "What are you going to do?" my father finally whispered, his voice so weak I almost didn't hear it. He still believed this was a negotiation, a final play in a game of power. "Are you going to take it all? Are you going to ruin us?" I looked at him, and for a moment I saw the man he could have been. The man who could have been proud of his daughter. The man who could have taught me about honesty and integrity. But that man was gone, buried under a lifetime of greed and deceit. And the man in front of me was a stranger, a man who had built a life on a lie. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I could ruin you. I have all the power. I own your company. I own your legacy. I could take everything you have worked for, everything you have ever been proud of, and I could burn it to the ground. But I'm not going to." My father's head shot up. His eyes, which had been filled with a cold, dead terror, now had a flicker of hope. He looked at me, a desperate plea for me to be merciful. He thought this was about the money. He thought it was about financial ruin. But he was wrong. He had been wrong about everything. "You're not going to ruin us," my mother whispered, a flicker of hope in her voice too. She seemed ready to grab onto any lifeline I offered, no matter how flimsy. No, Mom, I said, a sad smile on my face. I'm not going to ruin you. You've already done that yourself. You've ruined your reputation. You've ruined your legacy. You've ruined the trust your family has in you. And I'm not going to take that away from you. That is your consequence. That is your karma. And you have to live with that. But the money, my father stammered. What about the $1.2 million? The money is yours to keep, I said, and the words were like a physical shock to him. For now, my investment in your company is a gift, and it will be enough to pay off your immediate debts and give you a fresh start. You can use it to rebuild your company, to pay off your debts, to try and do something good for once in your life. But you have to do one thing for me. You have to face the music. My lawyer Darius has compiled all the evidence. I've sent it to the police. The land deals, the financial frauds, the people you took advantage of. I won't press charges. But I can't stop the legal system from doing its job. You have to face the people you have wronged, and you have to face the legal consequences of your actions. This is your chance to do something right for once in your life, to be the man you always pretended to be. My father was completely silent. He was staring at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He couldn't believe I was giving him a chance. He couldn't believe I was walking away from the money, but I was. Because the money wasn't what I wanted. I wanted my dignity. I wanted my freedom. And I wanted to show him that I was not a pawn in his game. I was a player in my own. I turned my gaze to Jamel, who had been sitting in silent awe throughout the entire confrontation. He was looking at me with a look of immense pride, a look I had never seen from him before. He had always been the golden boy, the one who was supposed to be the future of the family. But now he was just a boy sitting there watching his family crumble. Jamel, I said, my voice soft. I know you helped me. You told me the truth and you risked everything for it. I'm proud of you. I know you're going to be a good lawyer. You're going to be a good man. You don't have to be like them. You can be your own person. You can stand on your own 2 feet. You can build your own legacy, one that you can be proud of. He just nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. He didn't have to say a word. I knew he understood. I knew he was finally free. I stood up from the table, my heart light and my body feeling weightless. The air, which had been so thick with tension, now felt fresh and clean. My family was sitting there, a tableau of shame and defeat. They were silent and they were alone. And I knew in that moment that I was finally free. I had not just taken back my money. I had taken back my dignity. I had taken back my life. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving the broken family behind. The night was cool and quiet, the city lights a beautiful blur. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just walking away. I was walking towards something. I was walking towards my own future, my own legacy, a legacy that was finally truly mine. And as I walked, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I had finally found my way home. I got into my old Honda Civic and let out a long, shaky breath. The cool night air hit my face, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the Sterling Rose restaurant. I put the key in the ignition and turned it, and the engine hummed to life, a familiar, comforting sound. The car felt like a loyal friend, its worn seats and familiar dashboard a stark contrast to the perfect, sterile luxury I had just left behind. For a moment, I didn't turn on the radio or put the car in drive. I just sat there listening to the quiet rumble of the engine, the only thing in this world that felt truly honest to me right then. My hands were still steady on the steering wheel, but my heart was a different story. It was soaring. I had left my family sitting at that white tablecloth, a tableau of shame and defeat. My father was no longer the arrogant, confident man he had always pretended to be. My mother's perfectly manicured life was in pieces. And my sister Tiana finally saw me for who I was. Not just the black sheep of the family, but a person with her own power, her own mind, and her own way of doing things. I didn't feel any joy from their downfall, not the kind of malicious satisfaction that revenge stories are supposed to have. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. It was over. The game they had been playing with my life for 2 decades was finally over. As I drove away from the bustling streets of Buckhead and headed back to my own home, I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The city lights were a beautiful, blurry mosaic, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my own future, a future that was finally mine to shape. My mind went back to that day 10 years ago, when my father had humiliated me in front of his friends. I could still hear his cutting words, a dirty bay, stupid job for men who couldn't cut it in the real world. He had told me I was too stupid to understand what a real future looks like. He was so wrong. My love for cars, for the honest work of rebuilding something from the ground up, was the very thing that saved me. It gave me a foundation. It taught me patience and precision. It gave me a place to put all the anger and shame, and it turned it into a powerful, quiet force. My garage, Aisha's Classic Restorations, is a reflection of me. It's not a flashy multi-million-dollar corporation like my father's. It's a place of quiet, honest work. I specialize in restoring classic American cars, the kind with soul, with history, with a story to tell. My clients aren't just rich men with expensive toys. They're collectors, people who respect the art and the history behind the machines. They trust me because they know I put my heart and soul into every single nut and bolt. And through that work, I've built a life that is truly my own. I don't need a fancy car, a designer dress, or a corner office to feel successful. I just need a good engine, a clean wrench, and the honest scent of motor oil. My father spent his life building a legacy of money and power, a legacy he was so proud of. But it was all built on a foundation of lies and deceit. He used people. He hurt people. And in the end, it was that very legacy that almost destroyed him. My legacy, on the other hand, is built on honesty, on hard work, and on helping people like Ronnie and Ms. Shirley who just needed a second chance. My father's charity was always public, a performance for the cameras. My work was always quiet, a hand extended in the darkness. He wanted to be a hero, and he built his empire on the backs of others. I just wanted to be a good person, and I built my life on the strength of my own 2 hands. And that I've learned is a legacy that no one can ever take away from me. It's a legacy that can't be bought or sold. It's a legacy of dignity, of self-respect, of restoring not just old cars, but humanity itself. The work I do in my garage is a metaphor for my life. I take something that is broken, that has been left for dead, and I fix it. I put the pieces back together, I polish the rust, I restore the engine to its original glory. I don't just fix cars, I give them a second life, and that's exactly what I did for myself. I took the shame, the humiliation, the pain, and I turned it into fuel. I rebuilt my life from the ground up, and I made it a masterpiece. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this: don't ever let anyone else define your worth. Don't let them tell you what a real future looks like or what a real job is. Your passion, your dreams, your hard work, that is your legacy. Don't let anyone take that away from you. And if you have to walk away from a family, from a career, from a life that is trying to tell you who you are, then do it. Take a chance. Walk away. Because sometimes leaving everything behind is the only way to find yourself. It's the only way to find your true home. I'm so grateful to have had this chance to share my story with you. If any part of it resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've ever had to leave something behind to find yourself, please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed my story and want to hear more like it, be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel.